This is GARIS, Masculist, MGTOW flyers. That is 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de GARIS. This is flyer number 376, entitled How Masculism Forces Women to Grow Up. Description. This flyer shows how masculism is forcing women to grow up, to take responsibility for their own adult lives, not expecting to parasite off the money of a man, not blaming men for women's inadequacies, etc. A list of points is given which show this masculinist forcing of women to grow up, with each point elaborated. Flyer itself. How Masculism Forces Women to Grow Up, by Prof. Dr. Hugo de GARIS. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. This flyer attempts to paint an emotionally vivid picture for women, showing them how masculism is forcing them to grow up. It lists the major ways that masculists are forcing women to abandon their traditional expectations and attitudes towards men, and if not, then this flyer spells out in bleak and brutal terms how women will be punished by men, that is, masculisted men, in brackets, which in time will be most men as masculist ideas spread, if they don't grow up. Here is a short bulleted list of ways that masculism is forcing women to grow up, followed by an elaboration of each point. 1. Masculism is making fluffies manless, babyless, and spat at as man-slaving vermin. 2. Masculism will force schools to fippify young women. 3. Masculism will force the men-fairing of the gender laws. 4. Masculism will turn the tide on gender politics. 5. Masculism will force feminists to become bi-conscious. 6. Masculism will crush feminazi misandry. 7. Masculism will crush feminazi isinacy. Now the elaboration. 1. Masculism is making fluffies manless, babyless, and spat at as man-slaving vermin. The core idea of masculism is that it is a rebellion by men against being man-slaves to women, against working for women. It was men who liberated women from household drudgery by giving women the male-invented contraceptive pill, household gadgets, modern medicine, life expectancies well into the 80s, so that women are now having 0, 1 or 2 kids in most cases, so have a career window of half a century. The masculists are telling women in very strong moralistic terms that now that women can work, they must work. Anything else is manslavery and hence a moral abomination that, if sustained, will get these fluffy parasites killed. I was trying to get my girlfriend, who is very much a FIP, financially independent person, in practice, but who has not been exposed to masculist ideas before, how she would feel about her next-door neighbour if she heard, hypothetically, that he owned a gold mine in Central Africa which used Negro slaves as the miners of the gold. She said she would be disgusted and full of hatred. Why would you be so full of hatred? Because slavery is a dictatorship of one person over another, forcing the slave to work for the dictator for no wages, destroying the slave's life. So how is that different from what a fluffy does to a man-slave? I understand what you are saying intellectually, but not emotionally, because men have always worked for women, since women got pregnant all the time, so have always depended on men to work for them. Yes, that's true, but women now have the pill and have a career window of half a century. So those women who don't FIP up and bother to get a career competent education so that they are FIPs as adults, then their fluffydom will cause them to expect to parasite off the labour and money of a man, making them man-slavers, and hence hated by the masculists, who see them as immoral, parasitic, man-slaving vermin to be wiped out by not getting a man, as nearly all men over time become influenced by masculist ideas, who then see such fluffies as manslavers, as vermin. So will punish such women by totally ignoring them, not even pumping and dumping them, so that their fluffy parasite genes are removed from the gene pool. That's end quote. Such women will then be made by masculism to be manless and hence babyless. Fluffies will not be able to get the sperm from the quality men they desperately want to mate with in order to obtain the quality DNA from such men for their kids. Fluffies will only be able to get the DNA from men with much lower SMV, that's sexual marketplace value, which means that these trash males will cause fluffies to have trash kids, which is a nightmare to fluffies, since it goes so strongly against their hypergamous instinct, that is, the instinct of women to want to mate with alpha males, to get these males alpha DNA for their kids, to have an alpha kid. Such a fluffy will not be able to attract a man who wants to live with her, so will have to become a single mother if she is to have any kids at all. Men strongly dislike working for another man's kids, which is why single mothers are usually manless. Men strongly advise each other not to date single mothers, who will only want to extract the man's resources for her, and in brackets, that is not his, kids. Tremendous moral pressure will be applied, initially by the masculists, and later by society as a whole, as masculist ideas are absorbed by the majority of the population, of both sexes, against fluffy parasitism. Fluffies will be seen increasingly as manslavers and hence slavers, with all the powerful hatred that such parasitism and immorality implies. Fluffies will be spat at, ostracised, rejected, cast out of society, until no young woman dares to become one through fear of being made a social reject. Such a prospect will terrify fluffies in the future, as masculism dominates gender politics, imposing its ideas on society, using male intellectual superiority and male verbal aggression that women cannot compete with. A fluffy can only be a fluffy if she can get her financial claws into some gullible manslave. The supply of such man-slavable men is drying up, as masculist and MGTOW, that's men going their own way, ideas spread through the culture. So as the number of man-slaves dwindles away to zero, fluffies will be forced to convert themselves into FIPs, or they starve. Any woman who publicly asserts to her social circle that she is a fluffy, who has fluffy expectations towards men, will be given the kiss of death by the men in her social circle. They will treat her as a fluffy parasite and cast her out of their circle, rejecting her as an Untermensch, as vile, as vermin, as hateable. We men have the financial power to force women to FIP up. Since most men are FIPs, we are raised to be FIPs and even evolved to be FIPs, since men could not have babies. We men had no choice but to be FIPs, so we don't need a woman to parasite off in order to stay alive. We can find our own food and money. But a fluffy expects to live off the money and labour of a man, a gullible manslave in the era of the contraceptive pill and long female life expectancies. One of the major tasks of the Masculists is to convince society that man-slavery is slavery and hence a war issue, and that the Masculists are at war against the fluffies, aiming to wipe them out. Masculism thus has the power to force fluffies to convert themselves into responsible adults who expect to pay their own way and not parasite off a man. Masculism has the power to force fluffies to grow up, to take responsibility for their own lives and not live as a child-minded fluffy parasite off the money of a man. 2. Masculism will force schools to fippify young women. As masculinist ideas spread throughout the culture, educational policy will change to reflect masculist values. Masculists will enter politics and project their masculist values and expectations on women and into social and educational legislation. One of the major complaints of the Masculists is that little boys are being badly abused by the feminazis, who are the large majority of the primary school teachers, so that little boys have few, if any, male role models, who have their little lives dominated by feministed young women, who, since they are primary school teachers, are not very bright, so absorb feminist ideas rather uncritically, believing what the Isaianate feminist leaders tell them. For example, men are toxic, men are rapists, men are pigs, men are morally and intellectually inferior to women. Little boys absorb these feminist values and feel dejected, inferior, believing they are the inferior sex, which wildly contradicts the scientific reality, that is, that men are smarter than women by 4 IQ points on average, have a 10% larger IQ variance, have won 99% of the Science Nobel Prizes, have a hugely superior performance track record compared to women, etc. The Masculists will force major changes in the primary and secondary schools, bringing masculist ideas to the classroom so that all students become bi-conscious, that is, learn how each gender oppresses the other and what needs to be done to overcome these gender oppressions. From the masculist point of view, it's very important for primary and secondary students to learn to become FIPS. Otherwise, they will be seen as fluffy parasites and hence will be severely punished by men and society. Young fluffies at high school will be rejected sexually and as potential girlfriends by their male classmates, who will see them as future manslavers, as vile, to be rejected and spat at. Life will be very unpleasant for young fluffies in the near future as masculist ideas spread. Governments will be under strong moral and political pressure by the masculists to boyfare the classrooms by giving male primary school teachers higher salaries than their female counterparts, to encourage more men to become primary school teachers so that little boys can have male role models who have been masculisted, who can tell these little boys that science shows that men are the superior sex, that men win nearly all the Nobel Prizes, etc., and they should be proud to be male. This masculist propaganda, coming from the masculisted primary school male teachers, will counter the corresponding feminist propaganda coming from the feministed primary school female teachers. These masculisted teachers, especially those in the secondary schools, will put strong moral and educational pressure on high school girls to fip up or to rot on the shelf. Masculist ideas will be part of the culture by this time, so the high school girls will be familiar with them and feel the pressure to be fips through fear of being rejected by their male classmates, who will treat them as vermin if these high school women don't fipify. Most of these young women's classmates and their teachers will be pushing them on moral grounds to fip up, to behave as responsible adults by getting a career-competent education that will make them responsible fips as adults, forcing them to grow up. 3. Masculism will force the men-fairing of the gender laws. Masculists are men, so have a monopoly over their male sperm. As most men become conscious of masculist ideas, they will see fluffydom as manslavery and rebel against it, forcing women to vote with men for the men-fairing of the gender laws. These masculisted men, who will become the large majority of men over time as masculist ideas spread throughout the culture, the way feminist ideas have, will tell women that if they want to have a man to be sexed, loved, and to have a baby, then the gender laws will first have to be men-fared, that is, made fair to men. Because in today's world, 2020, the gender laws are massively unjust to men. For example, the financial massacring of fathers in the divorce courts, where a divorcing father will lose custody of kids with a 90% probability, will lose his house to his fluffy ex-wife so that she can raise her kids in it, lose half his possessions to his fluffy ex-wife, forced to make child payments to his kids whom he will barely see. And if his ex-wife is a real fluffy, he may have to pay her alimony for the rest of his life, with no moral nor legal obligations on her to get off her fat, parasitic ass and fip up, so that she remains a parasite off him after the divorce, the way she does before the divorce. This massive gender injustice committed against men in the fluffy feminist hypocrite-controlled divorce courts is screaming out for reform. The other major gender injustice against men is the lack of the that's paternity rejection right, which is the most blatant of gender discriminations that exists, and it's not against women but against men. Women have the legislative right to reject an unwanted pregnancy, but men don't. So millions of women commit a major gender crime every year by lying to their boyfriends/husbands that they are taking the pill, get pregnant, then demand that he pays for the kid that he does not want, thus manslaving him for decades, which is why the masculists claim that women oppress men far worse than vice versa, because women's gender crimes are continuous and, in capital letters, last decades. Far worse than the way men oppress women. Masculistic men will soon have the power to force women to vote with men for the men-faring of the gender laws, threatening women with babylessness